Hello everyone, I'm High Treason and welcome to Duke Mapping Taboo Episode 4, Negatives. Like several other games of its time, Duke Nukem 3D uses a sector-based, so-called 2.5-dimensional engine which cannot render overlapping geometry. Apparently, I don't much like being told what to do. Out of spite, you could simply ignore this information and build your map without any consideration for such limitations, and that's a hell of a lot of Asians. But you'll quickly run into an effect known as a hall of mirrors. Ironically, this will happen if you try to put two mirrors within view of each other too, thus rendering actual halls of mirrors impossible. It is noteworthy that the way in which mirrors are handled may be vaguely relevant to what we're about to do. At this point, some people would give up and find something else to do, which would be sensible, but you might not have to do that. In order to draw a scene to the display, the engine has to do several things, and regardless of what it might look like, it doesn't do all of those things at once, a fact that we can totally exploit. Parallax skies are among the first things drawn, which is quite sensible as they always appear behind the level and are really big, so drawing them in front of the level would be stupid. Floors and ceilings seem to be next, followed by walls and lastly sprites. There is a whole system in place to handle depth sorting, which is an absolute headache on its own, and in the original renderer isn't always reliable, and in later renderers isn't always reliable either, but in different ways, though we shouldn't have to worry about that too much right now. Anyway, it seems we have a gap between the walls of this canyon here, which would make sense because it's a canyon, but the player needs to go over there and do something important. I don't know what. So as a level designer, you have a few options here. You could raise the floor of the canyon to be the same height as the floors above, but then it's not a canyon anymore, so this option is utterly crap. You could make a small sector to act as a bridge, but this would extend down to the floor of the canyon, so this option is a bit crap. You could put sprites over the gap, but this is going to look quite blocky, so this option is a little bit crap, although it's the best we've had so far. Probably the most sensible option would be to use a mixture of small sectors for bridge supports and sprites for flooring. This option is perfectly serviceable, and in most cases it will work perfectly. So this option is not crap, generally recommended 99% of the time, but it's far too sensible and I shan't entertain it. There is then another option. You could abuse the renderer and the order in which it does things to create bridges with arches. Of course, this structure should be completely impossible, so what on earth is going on here? Well, we'll talk about that as we build it. The first thing you want to do is draw a sector with walls running where you want the arches to appear. This is where it starts to get a little bit complicated because you need to make another sector around it. Almost like a kind of binding box, and it needs to follow what the arch sectors are going to do. With this in place, you need to raise the floor of the sectors up to the height you want your arches to be, or at least the lowest point of them, as well as then lowering the sector ceilings to the top of them, which generally would be the bit of wall that sticks up over the bridge's walkway. Split the sectors up or whatever as you require and add slopes as desired. You might notice that what you are making is the complete opposite of the arches you want to see, almost like a negative of sorts. At least that's what I call these structures. It looks pretty bad, doesn't it, right now? You don't need to worry about the wall textures of these sectors because you won't be able to see them in a minute, just ignore that. You may just be figuring it out now how the whole thing is going to work. For good measure, you need to make another bounding box around these walls. You don't always need this, but it is recommended, otherwise strange things can happen. And now we should have a 3-deep nested sector, the innermost being your archways, the middle being set up exactly the same as the archways now enough, and the outermost sector being at the lowest floor height of the area, that being the floor of the canyon, as well as having its ceiling height be that of the sky. Set the walls where you want your arches to be to display masks using the M key. The 1 key really isn't going to work, it's going to look all wrong. It can be quite fiddly to do this sometimes, and it's easier to make everything larger at first to work on it, at least wider, and then move the walls closer together later. Making the arches longer and shortening them will obviously mess up the slopes, so I wouldn't do that. Textures you can worry about a bit later though, because next you need to parallax the floors and ceilings of these nested sectors. The walls will vanish and leave only the masks visible. Congratulations, you now have a seemingly impossible structure and can now set up the textures for the arches. You can make a sprite floor to walk on, and obviously arches at the other side of the bridge too. You may need to add sprites along the top of the archway sectors, or else there's going to be a gap as well. I mean, you are looking down through a ceiling now. Walking against the archways will also clip the player into the sectors that make the archways up, and there's not much you can do about that aside from just blocking the walls of the bounding boxes so the player can't go there. You might just press 'N in the editor so you can still clip through them when making modifications, but I think most mappers at least have the fast level of this option enabled most of the time, so I probably don't have to tell you. Nonetheless, that does bring us to the downsides of this method. You can't walk under or over the arches side on at all, though you could leave a flat area where there are no arches in the middle, say towards the middle of the canyon, and make that with sprites so as not to block that area off. However, from the bottom of the bridge you will still be able to see a gap when looking up at the mask walls, as there's no way to have like a sloping ceiling underneath them now. You'll also have visible strips of sky on the ground where the sectors are, which you may have to cover up with more sprites. Overall, it is possible that you could get creative here, put some bushes and some blocking walls or something, so as to at least justify why the player can't walk there. Makes a little bit more sense. Nonetheless, what is going on here and why does this work at all when it maybe shouldn't at first glance? Well, parallax skies always seem to draw first, which is to say the sector doesn't bother drawing anything where one of them is. But we can see other sectors around it, and those do draw, so you can effectively see through the parallax sky and the arches. The only visible part of these sectors being the mask walls and any sprites. We just exploited the drawing order and used it to our advantage. Of course, it's not limited solely to building bridges. At a very simple level, you could build a slanted handrail or something equally basic. On the other hand, there's potential to build something more complex that I never really managed to explore. The sectors do have no tags or anything applied to them, so there may be potential to apply effects and have a more dynamic structure. Unfortunately, the sprite floor of the bridge means it will always be flat or stepped, which isn't really that big of a deal, but it's not always ideal either. The trade-off is that the bridge looks more three-dimensional, and if you do leave an area with no arches, with its walls made up of sprites, you can now have the player walk under and over it as well, which is pretty neat. You don't have to worry about this if you're just building these things as background scenery, then the player's never going to walk there. I suppose that's about all we have to do with this for today. There are some other things we could do, and we certainly could draw a sloped floor stacked over another apparent floor, but well, we'll save that for another time, and my closing notes are going to be, when I said this may have something vaguely to do with how mirrors work, well, mirrors sort of work like the parallax sky, in that all it's doing is setting that wall of the sector to not draw. It's just drawing what's behind the mirror before it draws the sector that you're looking at the mirror in. And as for 3D geometry, what about the build games that have room over room effects? Well, here's Blood. This hole in the floor. How's that work? It's not drawing the floor there. That's all that's happening. It uses the mirror texture, which signals the game just to not draw the floor. The sectors downstairs are drawn fast, and then the sectors you're stood inside of are drawn next. Frame rate's going to probably cut to about half to do this, so areas that it's in tend to look a bit more simple. And if you run on a slow computer, you can actually get it to desync for a frame or two, where the sectors won't quite move at the same rate. It won't update quickly enough when you move around, which is a little bit disorientating. Nonetheless, I do believe we've covered this as far as we need to today, and we can tackle stacking sloped floors up another time. However, I'm High Treason, thanks for watching, and I'll see you round. I did just want to point out that negatives like this are entirely possible in Blood as it happens, and as Blood has a fake room over room system in it, you can combine the two of them and make some pretty weird looking stuff, I'm sure. I don't map for that game, but I have included a map that I made just to troll Tekkadan, so you can download that and have a look at it if you would like. But, I mean, it uses the exact same technique as we've used in Duke 3D. There's There's no difference, only you'd have to use Monolith's crippled version of the editor that I just don't have the fucking patience for anymore.